I am a philosophy graduate. I got a master's degree. So according to your book, I wasted 5 years of my life. Why?
It depends upon what you mean by waste. If you mean, did you learn material that you were likely to use on a job, then I say no, you probably learned very little you'd ever use on a job. If you mean, did I get a degree that will help me to get a better job where I don't actually use philosophy, then I don't know how the Polish economy works, but quite possibly. And then there's the question of, did I actually enjoy the experience? That's something only you can answer. So you have to be more careful about what it means by waste. But if you are going into school in order to acquire job skills in the philosophy program, that's where I will say, no, you may very well get a better job, but it's not because you learn useful skills. It's because you got a stamp on your forehead saying, this guy was smart enough to get a master's in philosophy, so maybe he can work at your bank.
Okay, so you have this theory you call signaling, and you put it as an opposite to another theory, which is called human capital theory. And I guess that this human capital theory is much more popular than signaling theory. Why is it so?
Right. So the human capital is basically a fancy name for what normal people say anyway. So when parents or teachers talk about how important education is, like, you're going to school and you're learning really important stuff that you're going to use later in life, so you better get it right or else you won't be able to get a good job. All right, so that is the normal view. Of course, most people don't know that it's called human capital, but when social scientists think about these issues, that is what they call it. And again, the idea is that you go to school and it's a skill factory. You enter, you don't have skills, they pour the skills into your brain, and then you emerge, da-da, now I am a skilled worker. All right, and again, this is what politicians will also say, of course, we've got to invest in people, get our workforce. Right? I assume in Poland it's about the same. My story says, look, there's something to that. You do learn some useful skills in school, yes, but most of what you are learning in school, you foreseeably will never use in real life. And the reason why it pays in the labor market is not that you need the skills, you don't need to know the material they're teaching usually. Rather, the reason why it pays is that it is a way of signaling or certifying, grade A, that you are a student that is good enough to have done this well in school. And therefore, employers will say, hey, well, if he's got that master's degree in philosophy, I'll give him a chance. They won't throw his application in the trash.
Okay, but, well, I could agree with that if we were talking about philosophy or social or some political sciences or about economics even. But what about such faculties as medicine, law, engineering? I mean, they teach you quite useful skill on these kind of faculties, and you use this skill in your professional work.
Sometimes. Yes, so here's the thing. Basically, any field that sounds vocational and is hard, people will assume that you're learning a lot of useful job skills there. And in fact, I'll say that was my view too. I was thinking, well, you've got all the fields that aren't really very useful, but then you've got the hard fields where they're vocational. But what I've also found is whenever you actually talk to anyone who has done a allegedly vocational field, they too will say, wow, we waste a lot of time learning stuff we would never use in the real world. So my dad is a PhD in engineering. He spent a lot of graduate school proving theorems. You never prove theorems on the job unless you're an engineering professor, right? Or my wife is a lawyer, right? And in American law schools, they largely teach you the law of 12th century England. All right, so, all right, much of which is out of date, actually. It's even dangerously out of date. So while they are teaching some practical skills there, it's also very easy to overestimate how practical the programs really are. Almost every form of education does waste a lot of students' time.
So let's say we do not use what we learned at school. Well, this is also something I can agree with, but every time I point at this fact with discussions with teachers, they're saying that, well, maybe, but the content of what you learn at school is not as important as the very process of learning by which you increase your general reasoning skill. So, well, this is something you cannot do by yourself.
Yep. So that's a great story. Teachers love it. And obviously, the more useless your field is, the more you are going to want to believe this idea that, well, sure, you might not use trigonometry, but it hardens the muscles of the mind so that you can face whatever challenges you are going to encounter later on. However, there's a whole field called educational psychology that measures these effects, both experimentally and in other ways. They've been working on it for about 100 years. They really want to find these effects of learning how to learn or building thinking skills. And in general, they don't find very much. It seems that most of this is just wishful thinking. It's excuse making. And if people are not learning the actual content very well, or indeed, if the content is not very useful, right, then the odds that they're learning some other hidden, invisible skill that we promised you is actually very low. And actually, this whole analogy between the mind and the body, the mind too is a muscle, it actually proves the opposite of what people think. Because if you go and start working out your arms, right? I've been doing this for COVID, so I'm looking very good for me. Not maybe great for a human, but great for me. All right, if you do this, when I work out my arms, does that make my legs stronger? And it barely does, right? So the things that you practice, you get better at. And the things that you don't practice, you get worse at. And also, if you work hard on your body for a month and then give up 3 months later, you're going to look just the same way as when you started. So when you put all that together, it really does make you wonder, if the mind is like a muscle, then I better actually exercise the parts of the mind that I really need to use. And also remember, if I stop exercising them, then it's just going to go away probably. I'm going to forget.
But it could be quite hard to choose the right part of your mind that you have to train, because the mind is a system. You cannot really divide it into little pieces to train and to leave.
Well, actually you can. So if you want to train a pilot, you say, oh, well, who knows what pilots really need to know and what's involved in pilot training, anything could be important. No. When you're training pilots, you actually get them down in a flight simulator or eventually in a real plane, and you have them do exactly the kinds of things you want them to do later on. That is the way that you effectively train people for anything. Right? You get better at chess by playing chess, just like you get better at you get stronger arms by exercising your arms. And yeah, so again, like the idea that you can practice on anything and who knows, maybe it'll be useful is really pretty flimsy. Right? What you want to do is to practice the skills that you want to actually master. And when we measure them or when lives are on the line, we know what to do.
Okay,
right?
so
no one's going to take these vague stories about flying planes and say, oh, well, maybe he needs to read Shakespeare and learn about human mortality to fly a plane. Shut up. Just get down in the flight simulator and fly the plane with an expert next to you. Oh, you just killed us. Right? Let's do it again. Uh-oh. You just blow the wings off the plane. Do it again. Right? When we're in the real plane, we don't get a second chance. So let's learn now.
There's a lot of schools, especially private schools, actually, that tell parents that they teach critical thinking. So what do you think about that? Maybe this is some kind of particular skill that school can teach your kids. Critical thinking.
Well, so there's a lot of research on this, and again, it's mostly wishful thinking. Critical thinking can be taught, but hardly ever is. Right? Schools, of course, don't even really want very much critical thinking, because if you are thinking critically in school, you may start to say, hey, why are we doing this? And why are you in charge? And why do I have to do this useless, busy work? Schools are normally based upon obedience and shut up and do your work. Shut up and learn your critical thinking. Right.
Actually, your signaling theory says something quite opposite to the common belief, because what you're saying is that we need the education shapes or signals three features of our personality: conscientiousness, first thing, conformity, and the intelligence, right? So those, intelligence, well, that's something that people believe school helps you to develop, but conformity, not so much. Conformity is something people say, no, don't be a conformist because it's bad. You won't succeed in your life if you're a conformist. And what you're saying is that employers actually seek conformists.
Right. Well, so I don't know about schools in Poland, but in the United States, there may be some rhetoric about be your real you and don't be a conformist. But no, like the schools are forcing conformity down students' throats every minute of the day, practically for K through 12. Once you get to college, then you do have a break, and it's like, hey, everybody can be whatever they want to be. And in school, in college, they actually kind of mean it. They don't really make you do very much of anything in American colleges. If you don't feel like studying something, just take a different elective and avoid learning whatever it is that they're trying to make you learn. But anyway, I don't know, maybe Poland's really different, but my guess is that in Polish first grade,
It's the same.
a kid, you may tell kids to be themselves, but what you mean is sit down, shut up, do what you're told.
Okay, so actually, if education is all about signaling those three sets of skill as conscientiousness, conformity, and intelligence, why does it last so long? I mean, isn't there any cheaper and faster way to signal those kind of skills to employers?
Yeah, so two things. First of all, you have to think about who would quit school if there were large payoffs and it only lasted a month. So imagine school takes a month and at the end you get a 70% raise. Who is so lazy to refuse that deal? Almost everyone would do a month of school to get a very large raise. All right, so at the end of that month, almost no one has given up, and employers still can't tell the difference between the people that are willing to give up early or later because everyone's still there. So you can make it 2 months and still almost everyone's there, make it a year, make it 5 years. So actually the whole setup is that it needs to last long enough to get people to give up. And the payoff comes from being someone who didn't give up. Right? So that's the first thing to keep in mind is not only is it not puzzling, it's just what you would expect. When the rewards are great, the costs must be similarly great in order to lead to the attrition. Secondly, though, once you accept this idea that a lot of what you're signaling in school is conformity, then you realize, well, wait a second, suppose someone comes up with a brand new, original, radical, revolutionary way to signal conformity. Well, who will be the first customers for the radical, revolutionary way of signaling conformity? Probably nonconformists. And so there is a catch-22 here. The very people that try to do it in a different way fail to signal generally because there's what is expected of you. And this is very self-reinforcing. So in the United States right now, just for a middle-class kid to say, I refuse to go to college. No. Like family, parents, friends, teachers, all horrified by this. It is so normal in most of American society to go to college that it's really quite deviant to not do it. And the stigma, therefore, is very great, and only very odd people or people, like from middle-class families would just say no.
But well, we are sold this concept of dropping out of college or even not going to college as a way to succeed in your life. We're told that Steve Jobs didn't graduate, that Bill Gates dropped out of college, and so on. So that's not right.
Well, the answer is we have a few famous people who dropped out of college and did great anyway. And then we have a vastly larger number of people who did great who didn't drop out of college, and we don't hear about their stories, right? And then, of course, we have an even larger number who didn't go to college or dropped out, who then were failures. So again, like I don't claim that it is absolutely required to go to college to succeed, but it is statistically very important. And you can understand why a parent would be very nervous about a kid doing it, because usually it does end in failure.
So if education is mostly about signaling, then where those differences between the market premium for specific faculties, for graduating out of specific faculties comes from?
Right, so two things. So I mean, think about, say, a CS major. CS majors have two really good things going for them. One is they are studying material that is more practical in the real world, so they get some bonus from that, obviously. A second bonus, though, is that a CS degree is much harder in all ways than, say, a women's studies degree, right? And so when someone has the women's studies degree, you can say, oh, wow, all right, wow, women's studies degree, really impressed. On the other hand, CS, very impressive. right? In the United States, at least, it is very normal in finance for the top firms to hire people with degrees in engineering, in physics, and CS. People who don't know the difference between a stock and a bond can get a job on Wall Street because their degree is in a field that is impressive, right? So, you're a theoretical physicist. Oh my God, that has zero to do with what we do here. But if you could get a PhD in theoretical physics from MIT, I think you can understand our trading algorithm. That's the way things work here anyway.
But, well, from the perspective of employer, is this heuristic correct? I mean, is it effective? Is it working, Because you can be impressed with the diploma of your job candidate because he graduated from very prestigious college and he is a physicist or biologist or whatever, but then you hire him and you say, well, I was impressed, but now I'm not.
Yeah, right. So is the heuristic perfect? Of course not. There's no perfect heuristics. Are there better ones? Maybe. So there are some industrial psychologists who say that they know better hiring techniques and that you could really stop using educational credentials. But again, I would say that the use of educational credentials for hiring is so standard in the United States and almost every other country that it's just very hard to believe that it doesn't work, right? It doesn't have to work perfectly, but if you imagine going and opening up a firm where you ignore educational credentials and just say, I don't care about that, as to what would happen, my prediction is that even if you were to get people who are smart, they would have personality flaws. They would be lazy, they would be nonconformist, and would not be good team members. Of course, I'm always happy to have some who have a business owner try out a new method and tell me what happened. But if I were running my own business, I would not want to do this because I'd say, this is my money. I don't want to go and try something that everyone else seemingly has confirmed is a good idea.
Okay, so if one will judge your arguments as correct, that signaling theory is the right theory. So let's start from the individual perspective, from the perspective of a young man or a young girl that is just trying to choose whether or not to go to college. What would be the practical conclusions out of it?
Right. So the most obvious practical conclusion is this: just because what you're learning doesn't seem useful in the real world does not mean that you can quit and get a good job. So you need to look at what the credentials do employers expect, not just is the material that I'm learning really useful in the real world. So that's the most obvious one. Actually, people sometimes read my book and say, so you're saying I should drop out. And I'm saying, no. Actually, I'm saying that even if you are correct to think that what you're studying is not useful, you probably should not drop out. Now, in terms of broader advice, because the book doesn't just do signaling, I try to put all the pieces together. The main thing that I say for college is that if you did very well in high school, then probably you will do well enough in college to benefit from it. But on the other hand, I do say if you were a bad student in high school, then it is probably a bad idea to go to college. Why? Because your odds of finishing and doing well are very low. And almost all the payoff for college comes from graduation. So if you are statistically unlikely to graduate, then it is generally a bad investment to attend.
So, and now, okay, this is the individual perspective. What about public policy? Because, we're told, because there's actually the strong consensus among decision makers that investing in national education is a good thing because it increases human productivity, it increases innovativeness, it leads to faster GDP growth. So, everyone says, let's invest in education. How does consensus look from your perspective? What are practical conclusions here?
Yeah, so I say this is the big difference between what I'm saying and what almost everyone else is saying. So it is normal to say that education is lucrative. And I say, well, probably not as much as people think, but yes, education is lucrative for the individual. But then almost everyone else says, therefore, let's have society heavily support education to a richer society. And I say, no, wrong. Education is a good way to get stamps on your forehead and get a better job for an individual. But if a whole country gets a bunch of stamps on their forehead, this does not raise productivity and does not generally enrich the country. So what I say actually is that national investments in education, so-called, are mostly waste. Most of what students study, they'll never need to know again. It will not help them do better in real life. And so actually be much better for people to get a lot less education and to start working at an earlier age. So I don't know how much of a German style apprenticeship system Poland has. So what is it like there? Do you have apprenticeships like they do in Germany?
Do we have what?
You have apprenticeships where much younger people go and on the job and they get trained in jobs?
Well, in Poland, in high school, you don't work. When you are studying at some faculties, you are forced to do something which is called a practice, and it lasts. I don't know how is that right now.
But do you have like that European system of gymnasium and then regular
We don't
school?
have a gymnasium. We have elementary school. We have high school, and this is purely theoretical. And then we have college, and sometimes in college you are forced to take part in some kind of a practical thing.
But so in high school they're not training you to work in car factories.
No. Well, no, they do not.
Okay, yeah. So in Germany and Switzerland, they have a very different system. When I say and the system is that students that don't seem like they're likely to go to college, they encourage them to learn a trade when they are still young teenagers. And again, I say that's a much better way of investing in people than having people learn the history of European philosophy in high school. But I don't know. So in Polish high school, do you learn history of philosophy?
Yeah. Well, mostly history rather than philosophy.
Okay. All right. So not quite as crazy. I know, like in German gymnasium, I think they will do like history, German philosophy. So,
well, to be honest, we have something which is called technicum, and this kind of schools teach you how to perform a specific profession.
Okay, so maybe you're not so different from the German system.
No, it is different because in Germany, at a specific age, you are kind of judged by the system whether to go to high school or to Realschule, because it's called Realschule. So, well, it's different than Germany. We have a part of this practical training, but actually it doesn't work too well these days. But okay, maybe your case against education is just a case against public education. Maybe private schools are doing better in terms also of this human capital theory. What do you think?
Right. So I would like to believe that, but I don't think the evidence is generally there. So when I look at private schools, the curriculum seems extremely similar to public schools. Now, actually, in 2020, there is one enormous difference between private K through 12 schools and public K through 12 schools. And that is that the private schools are still open for daycare. Right. So the public schools in my area are completely closed. All kids can only get Zoom school. But the private schools are open because they know people are not going to pay $20,000 or $30,000 a year to have their kid go to Zoom school, and therefore to stay in business, private schools are at least providing the daycare. So I have this blog post where I called "Not Even Daycare," where I said, look, I've never been a fan of the education system, but at least until 2019, they provided daycare so the parents could go and do their jobs and live their lives. And now the schools can't even do the one thing that they actually were useful at providing.
You are a fan of homeschooling, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I would say is that by European standards, I'm definitely a fan, because most Europeans that I talk to think it's terrible. Right? I remember when I was in Germany and I told the Germans about it, and they just looked frightened. And they look. And then there was but you must, the government closely regulates you at least. I'm like, no, not at all. Like, but at least you must teach your children the government authorized curriculum. No, teach whatever I want. Right? So this was their reaction.
So, but you've got 4 kids, is it correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So, and each one was or is homeschooled?
Right. So now all of my kids are homeschooled because there are no physical schools left in the area, and I could spend a pile of money for private.
But in normal times,
So in normal times, I was homeschooling my 2 older kids And then my younger son, I was planning on starting him soon, and then my daughter later. But again, the main thing I say about homeschool is that it is a very good option for some people. It's a very good option for some people. So the Germans who are frightened are really quite crazy. Es ist Wahnsinn. I don't know. I don't know how much.
But you personally teach your children, or you hire private tutors?
So I do it myself. So again, I could, of course, just hire a tutor instead. But for the older kids, I started because they were very well behaved, and it's something that I enjoy doing. I am an educator, so to have students that actually want to be there and actually want to learn, it's really nice for me. And it's just a nice thing to share with my kids. But of course, it works because I have a special kind of job. I'm a professor where I have a lot of flexibility. And then for my younger kids, honestly, we've started because there's no real school anymore. And if you send them to Zoom school, you still have to do an enormous amount of work to monitor them. So I figure, why not just fire those losers and do it myself and do a good job, because I know how to do a good job. Right.
But what do you expect them to become in life? I mean, in general, because normal schools teaches you how to be a good employee. When you teach children at home, you might have a different perspective on their future. Yeah.
So again, I would always advise people homeschooling to adjust their techniques for the child. A lot of the reason to do it is so that you don't have to follow one set of rules for every person. And you can pay attention to what kind of kid is this? What does this kid want to do with his life? What would he be good at? And then vary what you're doing based upon that. My older sons have long been interested in being professors. And so this is a job I know a little bit about, since I've been a professor now for 23 years. So I have a lot of guidance for them. I know how to prepare them. And for them, it's really easy. For my younger kids, I said, well, probably you don't want to be professors. There's lots of other things to do. But I do try to focus on, above all, math, because math is something that is genuinely useful in a wide range of occupations, and hardly anyone enjoys it. So things like reading and writing, they're useful, but a lot of people do that for fun, but hardly anyone does math for fun. And then, I know I've met a lot of people who were homeschooled, and I would say that most people are overly pessimistic. People homeschoolers generally are at least as well educated as the general population, but there's one deficit that homeschoolers often have, and that is in math. So basically, people where their parents just say, just teach yourself whatever you want, they still wind up being generally very good in reading and writing and things like that, but their math skills do tend to be poor. And especially for how smart they are. I've met some people who are super smart, but no one ever made them learn math, and then they don't know it. Basically, I would say that a good formula for homeschooling is you do whatever you want to do plus math, right? And that way your kid will be well prepared for the future.
So in your opinion, will pandemic change people's approach to education, or rather it will change the system?
Right. Well, so it's changed both for a while. The main question is whether the changes will last. Right. And my best guess is there'll be some small lasting changes. So probably this will mean that there'll be twice as much Zoom school as there was as we would have expected back in 2019. All right. So we have an enormous amount right now, and I think it will go back to something like twice what the trend was. So that makes sense to me. But again, as long as the pandemic ends within 3 or 4 years, I think we will basically go back to something very similar to the way things were before. Again, the reason why we changed, it's not because people are really looking for better ways to do things. It's just looking for ways to continue the old system with as closely as possible without actually ever seeing another human being.
Thank you very much, Professor Caplan, for your time and for this interesting talk.
Okay, great.
Hopefully craziness will end soon, but hopefully also education will change for the better.